In this Baldur's Gate 3 video, I'm going to be showing you 3 fighter builds that you can use in the early goings of the game. These are level 6 fighter builds, and I'll be talking about like how they play at the early goings of the game and how you can advance them further as you level higher. So the first build we're going to take a look at is 5 levels of Eldritch Knight and 1 level of Wizard. You could actually do this 6 levels of Eldritch Knight and have the same amount of spell slots at this point. However, by taking 1 level of Wizard, you will be able to learn spells from scrolls, which will give you a broader range of spells that you can cast. And I've waited until after level 5 to take 1 level of Wizard here, and that's because you want to be able to gain that extra attack from Fighter. Even if you're playing an Eldritch Knight, that extra attack is extremely strong, and you want to be able to get to that as quickly as you can. The spells and everything you have on top of that are a nice bonus, obviously, but you don't want to take like 2 levels of Wizard and 4 levels of Fighter and miss out on that extra attack at this point. And one thing I really like about this build too is even one more level higher than this at level 7, if you're playing Eldritch Knight, and you take another level of Eldritch Knight, you're going to gain level 2 spells and level 2 spell slots, and you're also going to gain an extra feat. So this is really, really strong, like mid-game and, on until later parts of the game. And what I really love about Eldritch Knight is it gives you all the best things of the fighter, right? Like you still get the feats, you still get extra attacks, but you do gain spells as well. You still have action surge, you have a fighting style. You're going to be able to cast some spells and use like shield to protect you when you get attacked in combat, which is really, really strong. And a fantastic use of a spell slot on an Eldritch Knight who can still spend their turns attacking. You can throw a magic missile to finish off a weak enemy and hit another enemy. You can use Thunder Wave to knock enemies back. There's like a lot of things you can do with this build that, maybe a regular fighter wouldn't be able to do. Like a Battle Master, a champion just wouldn't have access to these things. And by multiclassing with Wizard, if you take 2 levels of Wizard, eventually you're going to gain a subclass of Wizard that's going to give you another passive ability. Either like maybe you're playing Evocation and you don't want to worry about hitting friendlies with AoEs, you can take that. Or maybe you want Arcane Ward from, Abjuration, which is fantastic to help protect you in combat. Makes you even more tankier as a fighter. So there's a lot of things you can gain just from 2 levels of Wizard, and this will still allow you to get eventually, as you level up your Eldritch Knight, all the subclass features of Eldritch Knight on top of it. You do sacrifice the improved extra attack at level 11, but I think the spell casting sort of offsets that in this build. And another thing I want to mention about this build, if you're just using like Magic Missile as your offensive spell and you're using like other protective spells like Shield from Abjuration or things like that, you don't really need any intelligence. Like if you're gonna be mostly attacking but you just want access to some buffs and things like that, maybe Magic Missile every now and then you don't really need intelligence. So you can still put your stats how you would normally put them as a fighter, whether that's dexterity or strength. And the other thing is the Warp Headband of Intellect is great for this class because that's going to give you 17 intelligence. So even if you dumped intelligence and weren't planning on using spells, if you're equipped with that, you're still going to be able to cast your spells relatively effectively, at least in the early goings of the game. And that's going to allow you to fling offensive spells as well if you want. And the next build we're going to take a look at is 5 levels of Champion and 1 level of Barbarian. And what I really like about this build is you're building towards, kind of like the Eldritch Knight build, you're building towards a much more powerful build later on in the game. And you're going to get all the things I mentioned before from Eldritch Knight. You're going to have extra attack from 5 levels of Fighter. You're going to have Fighting Style. You're going to have Action Surge. You're going to have a higher crit chance because champions only need to roll a 19 or 20 in order to crit, which synergizes very, very well with Barbarians, and I'll explain why. So Barbarians at level 1 gain access to Rage, which allows them to add 2 additional damage to their melee attacks, improvised weapons, and thrown objects. It's also going to give them damage resistance or cut the damage in half from physical damage, and they have advantage on strength checks and saving throws, which is great, which means that, they're not going to be able to be shoved very easily, and spells that target their strength, they're probably going to resist most of them or save against them. And then when you hit level 2 of Barbarian, which is what you're going to do immediately after this, so at level 7 this gets a lot stronger, you're going to gain Reckless Attack, which is going to give you advantage on your attack rolls. And because you only need to roll a 19 or a 20 in order to crit because you're a champion, it's going to even increase the likelihood that you're going to crit, right? Because you're going to roll 2 dice. So only one of those dice has to be a 19 or 20. So your crit chance is going to be even higher by having advantage on all of your attacks. The downside being that enemies have advantage against you, which again, you'll still have damage resistance from Rage if that's up. So that's not the end of the world. And you will not be able to use heavy armor with this build because of the Rage aspect, or at least when you're raging, you won't be able to. So you do kind of have a downside there. But the idea here is that we're building towards 9 levels eventually of Barbarian and 3 levels of Fighter. But at this point of the game, you're going to want 5 Fighter in order to have that extra attack. Because if you went 3 levels of Fighter and 3 levels of Barbarian, you really wouldn't have, you'd be more at a disadvantage at this point of the game. But eventually you'll respec and you'll have 5 levels of Barbarian and 3 levels of Fighter, and then you'll go up the rest of the way in Barbarian, because at level 9 on Barbarian, you're actually going to get to roll an extra crit die when you crit. So not only do you have a higher chance to crit from advantage on all of your attacks with Reckless Attack, but then when you do crit, it's going to hit harder. So there's a really nice synergy there eventually later on in the game. And that's, not even mentioning some of the other things that Barbarians gain, like they have, unarmored defense, allowing them to add their Constitution modifier to their armor class if they're unarmored, which you can absolutely play this build unarmored and still have really good damage. So there are ways to play this build unarmored as well if you want. And, Barbarians gain a lot of other really passive benefits. So this is a really, really strong build. And then the last build here is just pure 6 levels of Battle Master. And what this is going to do is it's going to give you access to, the different maneuvers that Battle Masters have, allowing you to use those in combat effectively. There's some really, really strong ones here, like the one that allows you to cleave enemies in front of you. This is really good for AoE, just like a regular AoE attack in combat, which is something that fighters don't always have, allowing you to deal with multiple enemies without having any spell casting or anything like that. Another one that's really good, Evasive Footwork. This makes it so that enemies receive disadvantage on melee attacks against you until your next turn. That's huge, right? Because you could be surrounded by 8 dudes and none of them can hit you basically for a turn, because you already have high armor class as a fighter anyway, particularly if you have a shield, and then they have disadvantage on all their attacks. You can just tank for days with this, and it only costs 1 superiority die. And since at this point of the game you have 4 every short rest, that's you're super tanky with just that one maneuver. And just like the other fighter builds I've shown you, you're going to have a fighting style at this point. You're going to have action surge. You're going to have extra attack, and you're also going to have a second feat that you can use for something like Great Weapon Master or something like that, which is really strong, right? You kill an enemy or you critically hit, you're going to gain another attack as a bonus action. That's really good, even if you're not using a two-handed weapon. Maybe you're using sword and shield, and you kill an enemy, now you get an extra free attack, giving you 3 attacks in a turn. All these things are really, really strong, make for a really solid fighter. And depending what you want to do with this build moving forward, like if you're playing dual wield, for instance, or something like that, you could mix this with Thief Rogue eventually in order to have an extra bonus action that you can attack with your offhand weapon. Or you could just keep climbing up Battle Master and gaining more maneuvers and more superiority die. Remember that superiority die also add damage to the attacks that you make with maneuvers that deal damage. So you're not going to just deal regular damage when you do those, you're going to deal increased damage, which is fantastic. And that superiority die only gets stronger later on in the game, going from a D8 to a D10, so that increases the damage that it's going to deal further too. Frankly, if I had to recommend a fighter build to a new player, I think Battle Master is probably the best way to go. Champion is easier in terms of everything is basically passive on that character, so you don't really have to learn a lot about it. But I feel like Battle Master is a much more engaging fighter type to play than Champion. Because you have all these different maneuvers you can choose from, and each Battle Master might play differently based on the maneuvers that they choose. So that wraps up our beginner fighter builds. Again, we do have advanced builds coming. I know I see people frustrated we haven't put them out yet. I want to get through all the class guides. I was gone to Gamescom for a week, so I apologize about that. We had a little bit of delay there because of that, but I do want to get all through these, trying to get them all done before the PlayStation launch on the 6th. And, then we will start getting into more specific endgame builds. And as always, if you have further tips for new players, leave them in the comments. And if you have questions, I will try and answer them as best I can.